Although 3.9 billion people use the internet, still 3.7 billion remain unable to participate fully in the digital community. This first session will provide an overview of the state of digital inclusion, and not at least the understanding of the barriers that remain. The GSMA represents the interest of mobile operators worldwide, uniting more than 750 operators and 400 companies. GSMA committed to the Sustainable Development Goals already in 2016, making the mobile industry the first industry to make this commitment. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Acting Head of Mobile for Development at GSMA Foundation, Claire Sibthorpe.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here to speak to all of you. I'm going to talk about what the data says about access to mobile internet, and I'm talking about mobile internet because mobile is the primary way that most people access the internet, especially in the developing countries. And we really need to understand what the data says and what the issue is if we're going to address it. So just to look at some of the stats. Mobile internet access continues to grow. There were 300 million people who were connected to the mobile internet in 2018, which means that just under half the population is now connected. These are staggering figures. And we can see that access has increased significantly over recent years. In fact, the coverage gap, so those who don't have access to mobile broadband service, has more than halved between 2014 and 2018. But still, at the end of 2018, 750 million people live outside of mobile broadband coverage, and 40% of this population lives in sub-Saharan Africa. People who are living in sparsely populated areas are less likely to be covered, and in remote areas as well. Key to extending this network coverage it's a commercial issue, it's a cost issue. We need to reduce the regulatory and cost barriers to deployment, including rural infrastructures. It can be twice as expensive to deploy a rural network, and the revenues are 10 times lower than in urban areas. While the coverage gap is significant, it's also important to note that the usage gap, so those who live within areas of coverage but are not using it, is much bigger, 4 times as big as the coverage gap. So we really need to focus on this issue. It highlights the important factors that are stopping people from using the internet where there's coverage, things like affordability and digital skills. And those, as was mentioned in the earlier talk, those who are not using the internet are disproportionately rural, female, illiterate, and older. So rural populations, for example, in low and middle-income countries, are 40% less likely to use the internet than urban populations. I'm now going to talk a little bit about one of the key issues, which is the gender gap. Women in low and middle-income countries, 80% own a mobile phone. That's extraordinary. This device is giving women access to services that they didn't have access to before, and opportunities for them. But unfortunately, while access is increasing, we've been looking at the data over the last 10 years, the gender gap is not decreasing. The gender gap remains, in terms of mobile phone ownership, remains at 10%. This means that there are 400 million women who are still not connected. And the women who are not connected are the ones who would stand to benefit the most from having it, and they are the furthest away from achieving it. They are concentrated also in poor countries where women's position is most marginalized. And the gender gap is particularly big in sub-Saharan South Africa. As you can see in low and middle-income countries, women are 23% less likely to use the internet. But when you look at places like South Asia, that increases to 58%. It's wider in different countries, and it's again wider in rural areas. So again, this highlights that we need to have a focus on this. It's not closing on its own. I'm going to now look at another group, those with disabilities, again mentioned earlier in the first speech today. There are 1 billion people globally suffering from some form of disability, And by 2020, 2 billion people will require access to assistive technology. But only 1 in 10 are getting access to the assistive technology they need to live healthy, productive, independent, and dignified lives. We recently conducted research in Kenya and Bangladesh, and this highlighted that while access to assistive tech is extremely limited, mobile phones have the potential to be cost-effective tools for those with disabilities. They're breaking down barriers, they're increasing independence, and they're allowing people with disabilities to get access to basic services where that access is limited. But again, disabled people are less likely than non-disabled people to personally own a communication device or service. In fact, in Bangladesh and Kenya, where we did this research, they're 10% less likely to own a phone. And access to accessibility features, which are mostly available on smartphones, is another big issue. Less than a third of the people in these countries with disabilities owned a smartphone and were able to access those features. So if this is the challenge, what can we do about it? What is the barriers for causing this? So there are some structural factors. Lower levels of income and education affect ownership and use among women and those with disabilities. And over and above this, social norms have a significant role to play in the gender gap, and why it is particularly big in areas like South Asia. Social norms can limit women's mobility and financial autonomy, and male gatekeepers can feel that mobile ownership and use is inappropriate for women in a number of contexts. But each year we also do a survey where we survey 69% of adult population in low and middle income countries, and we analyze the results to see what are citizens saying about the key barriers to ownership and use. And you can see that the number one barrier for ownership is affordability, particularly handset affordability. There are also issues around understanding and awareness of the internet and the benefits it can have. And then once people are aware of the internet, the biggest barrier is literacy and skills. Again, affordability is still a key consideration around internet access, particularly around handsets and smartphone costs. There are other really important factors like safety and security and relevance that also emerge. So what can we do? What we know is targeted action is needed. If we don't take target action, we're not going to ensure that people are connected in this increasingly connected world. We also know from our research and data that we need to take a holistic approach that takes into consideration the social norms and the range of barriers. We need to ensure that women and men and those with disabilities and all the underserved groups, for them that internet is accessible, affordable, they have the skills and confidence to use it, it's safe and secure, and there's relevant content and services. What we need is more data and more understanding also of this issue to take those measurable specific actions. As I said, with the gender gap, we can see that it's not going to close on its own, and we need to take targeted action. We're delighted that mobile operators are taking a leading role in this. Operators like Telenor, who I believe are here today, who are part of the Connected Women Commitment Initiative, who've made commitments to reduce the gender gap in their market, in their customer base, with targets by 2020. They made these first commitments in 2016, and they've now reached over 19 million women with services, mobile money services, and are reducing the gender gap. They are going against the trend that the gender gap is not closing. So we know when the targeted measurable action is taken, it can make a difference. We need to ensure that people aren't being left behind, and it's important that we all take that action. We all need to look at what we can do. We can look at the barriers and understand the issue in our different contexts and work together to address this problem if we're going to ensure that we aren't leaving people behind. So with that, I look forward to the discussion today to hear more about the different initiatives people are taking, and also to get inspired by these actions and see how we can all work together to address this important issue. Thank you very much.
Please.